Hey, this is the World Advice Channel 2. What I want to talk about today is the problem with the might makes right argument, okay? So when it comes to the problem with the might makes right argument, that's become quite popular, by conservatives, in other words, the conservatives popularized the idea that what Europeans did when they colonized the world was nothing wrong because the history of the world has been full of conquest all the time and yada yada yada, the whole 9 yards. What I'm going to talk about today is the problem with their um argument for the might makes right argument, okay? With 2 points that will clearly debunk that whole might makes right argument, okay? So now I mentioned that, let's get started. So when it comes to the first point of debunking the might makes right argument is that the history of European colonialization was exceptionally brutal, okay? Because the thing about the might makes right argument, the whole idea that Europeans did nothing wrong with colonizing the world because other groups of people were colonizing other groups of people before and blah 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 blah, the whole 9 yards. Even when you get past the fact that just because somebody else does something some way somehow it justifies you doing the same thing. But anyway, aside from that stupid argument that they make all the time, well, everyone else is doing it so I can do it too. The truth of the matter is, when it comes to the European um colonialization, which completely debunks the might makes right argument, is that the European colonization was exceptionally brutal. Okay. It was not even a point of just simply conquering people for land. It was a point of, we want to conquer a group of people's land and we want to not only exploit them, force them to like work nonstop. We also want to make them hate themselves. In other words, believe they're inferior to the people who conquered them. Okay, that was what European colonialization is. Contrary to popular belief, when it comes to the empires of the past, whether it could be Middle Eastern, Asian, you know, um, you know, um, specific islander like Oceania, Polynesia, whatever you ever like to call it, and literally every other group of people on the planet. When people actually did conquer other groups of people in the past, yes, there was some, occasionally there was cruelty, but for the most part, they actually treated each other, believe it or not, quite well. Okay, contrary to popular belief, okay? Like, if you actually look at the history of the world, okay, which the best example would be the Middle East, since that's really kind of the cradle of civilization as we know it, like, obviously if you've heard about Babylon and like obviously other civilizations as well, like the Assyrians, and other ones like for example, obviously another one to add to that on that list could obviously be the Egyptians and all this type of stuff out there. There's a bunch, okay? As I'm certain you're aware, okay? When they actually did conquer other groups of people in the world, okay? Which, they actually gave them freedom of rights, okay? Yes, there of course, what they did was not the nicest thing, but they at least gave them freedom of rights, okay? As long as you paid your taxes and stuff, they actually genuinely couldn't really give a shit um about different things, okay? About like your race and this and that, because believe it or not, the Middle East at the time, it was made up of different races before, of course they eventually formed an overall identity known as Arabs. But for the most part, if you get the point, regardless of race and stuff, they did treat you fairly well as long as you paid your taxes. And sometimes those groups of people that were conquered even became quite significant and affluent in the empire. Okay, Europeans, when they colonized the world, it was just a blood fest. It was like just a psychotic, like, madness. It looked like, especially when you hear about what they did um the Native Americans, like when Christopher Columbus and his men traveled to the Americas, and even of course the history of African slavery and a lot of the different things they did, but specifically to Native Americans and Africans, it looked like something out of a horror movie, especially if you actually deep dig deep into that stuff, okay? If you really put the time and effort into researching it, not like movies like Roots or maybe for Native Americans, The Last of the Mohawkins. That's like a Disney version of it. If you actually take the time to watch some really detailed movies about what they did, it was just complete madness. It was just psychotic. Like it was like a psychotic person ran an empire. It was just sadistic and just kind of crazy. It's just straight up crazy, if anything. And you can look it up. There are movies about that stuff, like Goodnight Uncle Tom for African Slavery, I believe is what it's called. And I'm certain there's Native American equivalents, but whatever, you get the point. Like, there's like what they did was just extremely brutal, and not to mention, worst of all, they tried to teach the people to hate themselves, which hating yourself is the worst thing imaginable, okay? And trying to teach yourself to hate yourself is literally just like the worst humiliation imaginable. It literally is, okay? Because once you say you hate yourself, you can't take it back. You can't just say, wave the magic wand and say, okay, I'm going to take it back what I said. No, it's done. You're done. And like, how do you ever come back from that? And that's exactly what I'm trying to say here about Native Americans and Africans and a lot of the groups of people that the Europeans colonized as well, like Indians and other groups of people. What they did was evil and straight up wrong. Okay. So to answer your question, to say, oh, well, it justifies what we did when we didn't even treat the people well and we were having people raped, murdered, and straight up exploiting them physically as much as possible and even trying to make them hate themselves doesn't make any sense. You know, other groups of people, when they colonize things, which, as I said, I'm not saying it was right. But what I'm saying though, to try to say, oh, other groups of people colonized it, but they at least treated the people well. When we try to colonize them, we just try to terrorize them and make their lives as miserable as possible. Makes absolutely no fucking sense. Especially when you take into consideration the people that tend to conquer those people were of the same main group. This is of a completely different group who don't even know it at the time, at least when they went there, didn't even know the culture or anything about the place. They just showed up and treat everyone like shit. How does that make any sense? Okay, and that's the first point I want to get across, debunking the might makes right argument. Okay, the second point that debunks, more like I should have said, instead of debate, but debunks the might makes right argument is that if that argument is true, oh, violence is what determines what is right and what's wrong, when it comes to who rules a nation, then doesn't that just mean that pretty much it's acceptable for groups of people who are oppressed, like Native Americans, in the Americas? Oh boy, they have it bad, even worse than us black people, or not even just Native Americans, but every other group of people in the world who are oppressed, whether it could be the Australian Aborigines, and of course the Maori of New Zealand. If you make that argument that might makes right, it's about who can win, then doesn't that just mean that people that they have every right to have an uprising and just start shooting and killing people? Because well, it's not about what's right. It's not about there being anything wrong with killing people. But it's a case of, well, might makes right. Okay, so why not just simply put an effort to come up with a good strategy, military strategy, kill all these people, and then we can, of course, well, reclaim our land. Can you imagine if they were to do that? How much these conservatives would have a massive uproar about it. But as you said, might makes right. So violence determines what is right and what is wrong when it comes to what group of people control the land. So, in the end of the day, if you make that argument and you put that energy out there, then it might come back to hurt you. So, that whole argument they make is so fucking stupid because it just pretty much means that we're just going to go back to how things were hundreds, thousands of years ago, where everyone's just fighting against each other. And once a group of people conquer another group of people, they lose their land and then they get conquered maybe by the same people they once oppressed and all that type of stuff and all that war and madness. So that whole argument they make is so fucking stupid and is outdated. And That is the truth of the matter. It's just dumb. So in general, if there's a lesson to learn from the story, the lesson of the story, aside from just the whole point that might makes right argument is dumb, don't just look at things from face value. Actually take the time to analyze it, okay? Don't just hear something people say and just believe it in honesty, okay? And might makes right argument is just dumb. It's stupid. It's an oversimplification of the world, and it's an example of what happens when you take things at face value, okay? And that's exactly what I'm trying to get across here. So in short, the might makes right argument is stupid and is an example of why you shouldn't take things at face value, whether it's this topic or for anything. Always analyze the subject instead of just hearing somebody say something straight up and believing it, and that's the truth. So anyway, this is my video. This is off to say, and simply put, if you like this video and videos like this, remember to thumbs this video up and hit the subscribe button. And this is off to say, and simply put it, I'm out. So bye.